Hi, everyone. Welcome to Ray's Reads. Today we'll be discussing Eloquent Rage by Brittney Cooper. Um, this book was really interesting because I find myself like shaking my head and disagreeing with things. And then as she got to the end of her thoughts on what was happening, I was able to be like, okay, I see where you're coming from with this. So there was a lot of like reflecting happening throughout. She talked about growing where she grew up in a single parent household, violence that had been inflicted on her mother. She talks about being in academia for most of her life, um, and thinking about how that relates to education and where you can get a formal education, but an informal education as well with people. And she just talked about a lot of things. I want to highlight some of the things that really stood out for me and what's got me thinking. So, one of the things that was first mentioned was about Black feminism. And this book was written a few years ago. She talked about Beyonce bringing up feminism in her albums and how that was sparking a more, I guess, universal feminism. More people were aware. And I think it's really interesting because I recently read a book called The Limits of Liberal Feminism and how we have to push back against ideas of feminism that are around just choice and that our individual choices don't affect more than just us and how every decision we make is political. So that was one of the places where I was struggling with her, but I did agree that there is something about radically putting Black women to the forefront of society. And she talks about like dating and feeling invisible and all of the statistics. Marriage for Black women is much more difficult. um, and it was just very interesting to think about the idea of putting Black women to the forefront always, and constantly fighting that, constantly loving Black women out loud is so helpful. And it's not the only step to revolutionary change, but it is something that has to be intentional so that there are more Black women who can do more than just survive here, like we want more of a life than just surviving. There's so much more for us and we continue to dream it, and the best way to continue to make that happen is to continue to pour into Black women. um she also talks about, this kind of goes along with the idea I was saying about feminism, and she talks about empowerment and power not being the same thing. And on page 161, she says, "We must quit mistaking the two. Better yet, we must quit settling for one when what we really need is the other. Those who feel empowered talk about their personal power to change their individual condition. Those with actual power make decisions that are of social and material consequence to themselves and others." So, a lot of times, I even catch myself doing that, talking about women empowerment. But, like, what does it mean for us to actually have the power and not just feel empowered? And that's what I continue to think about as I move through the world and figuring out where there's places where I can actually have power. So, Brittany also talks about the relationship with God and finding feminism within it, womanism within it, and what does her life look like, even talking about sex as well. And I want to read this little part here that she talks about spirituality. And it was on page 187. She says, "What does it mean when our spiritual and theological systems impede healthy living? This is a question that Black women should begin to ask forthrightly. They should insist fervently on answers among themselves and from their spiritual leaders. We do a kind of violence to ourselves when we shut down our sexuality. It's not so much that I should have had more sex, although I wish I had in my 20s. It's that there are things we come to know about our bodies, our impulses, our likes, our dislikes, and desires when we fully engage the sexual part of ourselves. We go around missing critical knowledge about who we are, or might be, when we act as though sex isn't foundational to who we are. Um, and I think that's a really interesting question about how we view sexuality as impure or pure, and that's not how it should be viewed as all. And we struggle with the idea of, especially women, being told that their body needs to be pure for a man. Um, and that's questioning ideas of patriarchy, all of these things. But it's hard when you have foundations in Christianity, you have foundations in God, and this is what you're taught growing up. And she also talks about one time that her mom actually challenged the preacher on what he was saying, like during service, and not in a way that was loud, but just a shaking of her head. And he was like, "You don't agree?" And she's like, "No." And he was like, "Oh, okay." And just continued on. But that was that rage, that eloquent rage, that questioning of a man in the house of God and saying, "I don't agree with your interpretation of this scripture." And we should be able to question in the house of the Lord. And that is something that I know that I struggle with, because my thoughts are changing all of the time. And I do believe there is a God, but I don't believe that the God believes all of the things that we are taught. And there should be more room to question these things, especially when they're rooted in white supremacy. They're rooted in things that were meant to keep Black people at bay. So one of the things that I noticed that was about like half of the book was respectability. And respectability comes back time and time again, especially considering her upbringing. And then she talks about going through academia and education and elitism, and all of these things, they come up back to back. And she talks a lot about the Obamas and that their respectability wasn't enough to save us. Like, we had Trump. Like, it it shows time and time again that one Black person pulling themselves up by their bootstraps does not mean that we are all where we need to be, or that the system even works, because it doesn't. Um, and that's something that we have to like continuously think about. And that respectability is also linked to religion and Christianity. That if we do right, that God will bless us and we will have favor and all of these things. I wanted to point out this thing. I loved how Brittney said here, "I want to be clear that God has a place in how I think about justice and feminism, but I hate God explanations for structural problems." And just thinking about that in terms of respectability, and if you do right, you will get where you need to be. And a lot of times talking about favor and how to increase and make more money, and God wants you to be blessed and highly favored. These ideas of, if you do right, this is where you will go. And that's a lot of what is the word that they use in the church. It's a lot of like favor teaching, blessing teaching, abundance teaching, and it's not the reality. It really isn't. And so respectability even makes its way into those spaces. She also says on page 216, African American respectability might bring us to the highest office in the land, but it cannot ensure any level of long term respect for Black humanity, Black womanhood, Black manhood, or Black childhood. And that's what we see all the time. I had to come to grips with that because that was how I was raised. Um, and that there was a certain way to act and a certain way to be, and there's no way to be Black. um, and our lives shouldn't be dictated by how we look to white people. But sadly, that's how we have to survive. And now I understand how respectability politics have been used for survival methods, but when they become the politic itself, it's excluding, it's hurting fellow black folks. And so I think it was really important that Brittany had kind of said the difference between why respectability had to happen, like why you have to make sure you're always looking at white folks and seeing what they're doing because your survival depends on it, right? White woman tears, like your survival depends on these things. And so it makes sense why we have to adjust our behavior for survival. But when it comes to our ideas of being successful and being worthy of a life worth living, that's where it's got us all the way messed up. Um, Yes, Brittany talked about on page 292. Every time I write about the emotional lives of white people, some white person sends me an email or tweet and tells me, "How dare you act like you know what white folks are thinking?" Haven't white folks learned that black folks know them far better than they know themselves? Our survival is predicated on our willingness to study you, your impulses, your hard expressions, your laughter, and whether it reaches your eyes, your gifts, and your lies. Black survival means being endlessly obsessed with figuring out the depths to which white folks will fail to maintain a position of dominance. Um, and I think that was a really interesting way to put it, and that we have to know how to survive, but it shouldn't be our end all be all and it shouldn't be the determination of our worth. And lastly, I wanted to talk about education. And Brittany said that she had times where people had been calling her elitist because she does put value into her degrees, which is like, okay, like value into the education itself, right? And there is formal education you can get. I know that I learned a lot of things from formal education, but I also know that a lot of my peers learned the exact same things from informal educations being in it, right? Like, and that's what I've been trying for my life is to default to those who are living these experiences instead of me using all of my written knowledge and written academia and just say it plainly that this is the lives that some people are actually experiencing, right? And so my whole idea on how to continue to learn is that I know nothing. Right? Like I know something, but I know nothing. And there's still so much more to learn. And a lot of what we learn in education is about history, right? It's about the history of people and the true history of people, not the one that we have rewritten. And a lot of the history of people that you learn can come from being with those people in communion, like being next to those people, talking with those people. You can learn so much from actually sitting with people instead of reading about them. And I'm not saying that reading isn't good, like that's what Brittany was saying. She had learned a lot of things from being in school and academia and learning a lot from it. And that there is also value in things that you learn about being around people. Um, but yeah, personally for me, I think a lot of the things that my eyes have been opened up to have provided me a framework to move from. And right now, I'm definitely defaulting to people who are living those lives, who have already been through it, and just learning from them and what they put out. Like, I learned so much from being on Twitter and following people that have already written about these things. And I'm like, okay, I'll go read this so that I can understand it. And so, yes, formal education is very helpful for me, but I'm also in the community with the person that wrote it. And I get to see how they interact daily with people, how they call out different things that I can be more aware of. So I think both and is so great here, and it's necessary, right, to do the work. So yes, overall, I think this book provided a lot of like base information for people. I knew some of the things from class and things like that, but I think this would be a really good book. And I loved how it was basically asking us to challenge the world that we live in and continue to dream of a world that is better than we can ever know, right? And it's hard. It's very difficult, but if we continue to dream and continue to hope that this will be different and put in the work to make it happen, there could be such a beautiful world for us, especially Black women. Um, so yeah, I thank you for sticking out this review. I think we have a few more and then we will be done with Ray's Reads for 2020. So stay tuned.